March 3rd, 1944. East Anglia lay under a skin of frost, the airfield silent except for the low, steady rumble of generators and the cough of idling engines. Inside one dimly lit barracks, a young man sat alone at his desk. Lieutenant William Overstreet, a pilot of the 357th Fighter Group. His flight jacket hung over the chair. His hands were steady, but his eyes looked tired, older than his 24 years. He was writing to his sweetheart back home in Virginia. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "we're doing something they said couldn't be done, flying all the way to Berlin and back in a single-seat fighter." Outside, through the small window pane glazed with frost, he could see shadows moving under the floodlights. Ground crews, bundled in heavy coats, worked like ghosts around the silver wings of his P-51 Mustang. Under each wing hung something odd, two strange, cylindrical pods, painted dull silver, almost like giant paper packages. They looked fragile, temporary, absurdly out of place on a machine built for war. Some of the men laughed and called them paper bags. Others refused to joke at all. Overstreet had asked his crew chief what they were really made of. "Laminated paper, sir," the chief said, grinning. "Paper and resin. Same stuff the Brits been using. They'll hold long enough to get you there and back." Overstreet stared at the tanks for a long time that night. Paper and glue to cross the heart of Hitler's empire. He folded his letter carefully, sealed it, and set it beside his flight log. The light flickered once as the power strained under the cold. Somewhere outside, an engine coughed, then roared to life. He didn't know it yet, but by morning, that paper and glue would rewrite the mathematics of air warfare and change the course of the air war over Europe forever. Because sometimes, the most fragile thing in the world can carry the weight of victory. October 14th, 1943. The day the sky over Germany turned red. It began before dawn at Thurley and Thorpe Abbotts, when bomber crews of the 8th Air Force climbed into their flying fortresses and liberators for a mission that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Schweinfurt. Their target was the beating heart of the German war machine, the ball-bearing factories that kept every Messerschmitt and Panzer turning. If the Americans could cripple that, the Reich would grind to a halt. 291 bombers lifted off into a pale grey sky, engines thundering in the cold. Escort fighters P-47 Thunderbolts accompanied them as far as their fuel tanks would allow, roughly 375 miles into occupied territory. After that, the bombers were on their own. And that's when the Luftwaffe waited. At Schweinfurt, at Regensburg, they had studied American tactics, memorized their flight paths, and knew exactly when the little friends, the fighter escorts, would turn back. The moment the Thunderbolts wheeled away, the German fighters struck. A ball turret gunner named Robert Morgan later described it like this: "We were sitting ducks for 3 hours. Once the little friends turned back, Jerry came at us in waves. I'd look through my gun sight, and there'd be 10, 20, 50 coming straight on. I stopped counting. In just a few hours, 60 B-17 seconds were gone. 600 men were dead, missing, or captured. Whole squadrons disappeared from the sky before they even reached the Channel. When the shattered survivors returned to their bases in England, they came home to silence, to empty bunks and untouched coffee mugs. Mechanics walked down the line, counting what was left. Commanders stared at blackboards filled with red X's. At Debden, one young pilot wrote simply in his logbook, "Schweinfurt disaster." Colonel Hubert Zemke, one of the Air Force's most respected group leaders, said it bluntly: "If we keep losing bombers like this, there won't be a war left to fight." The problem wasn't courage, it was geometry. Every mile deeper into Germany widened the gap between the bombers and their escorts, a gap the Luftwaffe exploited with ruthless precision. That day, American commanders faced a simple, devastating truth. Unless they could find a way to keep fighters over the bombers all the way to the target and back, Daylight bombing the entire Allied strategy might collapse. And so, in the quiet aftermath of Black Thursday, as airfields mourned and factories replaced what couldn't be replaced, engineers and officers began searching for a miracle. But that miracle wouldn't come from steel or armor or horsepower. It would come from paper born in a newspaper mill across the sea. In the months after Black Thursday, desperation fueled invention. At 8th Air Force headquarters in England, engineers ran through every idea they could think of: auxiliary tanks, belly bladders, detachable pods, but all of them faced the same enemy: metal. Aluminum was scarce, costly, and prioritized for aircraft frames and engines. Every pound of it counted. Across the Channel, however, the British had already stumbled upon something radical and almost laughable. At a modest industrial site in Kent, a company called Bowater Lloyd, best known for printing the London Times, had been quietly experimenting with laminated paper for fuel storage. When war rationing cut off access to metals, the British Ministry of Aircraft Production asked them to improvise. Their answer? A fuel tank made entirely of paper, strengthened by glue and resin. Each tank began its life as sheets of kraft paper, the same coarse stock used to wrap newspapers. Workers coated it with phenolic resin, layer upon layer, pressing it over wooden molds until it formed a perfect aerodynamic shape. When it dried, they sprayed it with a fire-resistant lacquer, painted it silver, and sealed the seams with wax. The result was astonishingly light, 50 pounds empty, compared to 150 for aluminum. It was absurdly simple, yet dangerously clever. The resin resisted fuel long enough for a flight's duration, and by the time gasoline started to eat through it, the tanks would already be jettisoned. To the brass, it sounded like science fiction. To the pilots, it sounded suicidal. But inside the technical offices of the 8th Air Force, one man was willing to gamble: Colonel Cass Huff, a logistics expert with an engineer's curiosity and a pilot's stubbornness. He saw promise where others saw madness. If the British could make it work, the Americans could mass-produce it. He wrote in his notes, "It's not the metal that wins the war, it's the miles." And that's what this was about: miles. The P-47 Thunderbolt could go 375 miles. Berlin was nearly 750. The math didn't add up. But with a pair of 108-gallon paper tanks under its wings, a fighter could stretch to more than 850 miles, enough to reach the capital of the Reich and back again. In early tests, the tanks looked ridiculous, fragile, almost comic. Some pilots joked they'd catch fire if someone sneezed near them. Mechanics called them lunch bags. But when they realized that paper was the only material left Britain had in abundance, the laughter turned into respect. Because the war had become a contest not just of courage, but of resourcefulness. And in that contest, the humble paper mill was about to outwit an empire built on steel. February 1944. The winter skies over East Anglia were heavy with ice and rumour. Word had spread across the airfields. The paper tanks were finally ready for their first combat test. Most pilots laughed. A few refused outright. But one man, Major James Goodson of the 56th Fighter Group, volunteered. Goodson was no reckless rookie. He'd been through hell and come back flying. A survivor of the Eagle squadrons, one of the first Americans to fight with the RAF. He had seen men vanish in fire and smoke. If he trusted the paper tanks, others would follow. On a cold morning, his P-47 Thunderbolt rolled down the runway with two strange silver pods beneath its wings. Ground crews watched silently, some crossing their fingers, others shaking their heads. One mechanic muttered, "He's going to come down a torch." Goodson's voice crackled over the radio. "If this thing leaks, boys, I'll light up Europe." He took off into low cloud, heading toward Hanover. The paper tanks flexed slightly under the wings, shimmering with frost. And then, nothing happened. No leaks, no fire, no smoke. Hours later, Goodson's Thunderbolt came rumbling back over the field, engines smooth, fuel still flowing. He circled once, wagged his wings, and touched down. When he climbed from the cockpit, his grin said everything. "They work," he told the press later. "Not a drop spilled." That single test flight silenced months of doubt. Engineers pored over his aircraft, checking every rivet and seam, and found the tanks intact. The resin had held perfectly. The next day, a dozen more pilots took to the air with the same setup. Then 2 dozen, then entire squadrons. The results were the same: stable, reliable, astonishingly light. Still, there were skeptics. Some argued that the tanks would tear apart in combat. Others said the resin would dissolve faster in warmer air. And then came the biggest surprise of all. The paper tanks caused less drag than their metal predecessors. They were smoother, cleaner, more aerodynamic, a flyer's dream. At last, the concept that had been laughed out of briefing rooms now had believers. And just in time, because in the hangars of Debden and Leiston, a new aircraft was arriving, one faster, sleeker, deadlier than any that had come before. The P-51 Mustang. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and laminar flow wings, it could dance through the air at over 400 miles an hour. It was the perfect partner for the paper tanks, fast, frugal, and fierce. The combination changed everything. Where the Thunderbolt had strained, the Mustang soared. With 2 108-gallon paper tanks beneath its wings, it could fly 850 miles, more than enough to escort the bombers straight into the heart of Germany and back again. The plan was set. The pilots were ready. And in just a few weeks, Berlin, the city that believed it was untouchable, was about to look up and see the unthinkable. American fighters overhead. The dawn over East Anglia broke pale and brittle, a thin mist clinging to the grass. It was Sunday, March 4th, 1944, a date that would mark a turning point in the air war. At Debden Airfield, the men of the 4th Fighter Group shuffled into the briefing room, rubbing their eyes, clutching coffee mugs that had long since gone cold. The room fell silent as the mission map was uncovered. A single red line stretched from England across the North Sea, over Holland, through the industrial heart of Germany, and straight into Berlin. No one spoke. Someone finally whispered, "Berlin?" The word hung in the air like a challenge. Until that moment, no single-engine fighter had ever reached the German capital. The Luftwaffe had always counted on that their homeland airspace was sacred, untouchable. But that morning, the Mustang pilots of the 8th Air Force were told otherwise. They were going all the way. Outside, under hard white floodlights, ground crews had been working since 3 in the morning. Rows of paper tanks lined the tarmac, fragile-looking cylinders being filled with high-octane aviation fuel. Each tank held exactly 108 gallons, just enough to give the Mustangs the range they needed. But there was a catch. The resin coating that kept the tanks sealed would start to dissolve after about 5 hours. That meant timing was everything. If they lingered too long, the tanks could fail mid-air. Crew chiefs moved quickly, sealing caps, checking lines, wiping frost from metal. The smell of gasoline and lacquer hung heavy in the cold. One mechanic turned to another and said, "We're betting Berlin on paper, mate." Lieutenant Overstreet climbed into his Mustang, the same one he'd watched through his frosted window the night before. The paper tanks gleamed beneath the wings like ornaments made of silver foil. The crew chief gave a thumbs up. Engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. At 0900 hours, the first wave rolled down the runway, their wheels slicing through fog and mud. One by one, the Mustangs lifted into the sky, their contrails streaking eastward toward history. Hours later, over Germany, bomber formations appeared in the distance, massive boxes of B-17 seconds heading for the capital. Luftwaffe radar stations tracked them instantly. Orders went out, "Scramble! Intercept over Berlin!" German pilots rushed to their planes, confident as ever. They knew the pattern. The Thunderbolts would escort the bombers to a point, then turn back for lack of fuel. After that, the bombers would be easy prey. But that morning, something was different. As the German fighters climbed into the thin blue air, their eyes caught movement above the bomber stream, dozens of slender shapes gleaming in sunlight. Not Thunderbolts, not bombers, Mustangs. American Mustangs over Berlin. It took a few seconds for disbelief to turn to alarm. The radio chatter erupted. One German pilot shouted, "Impossible! Single-engine fighters here?" The air battle that followed was chaos. Mustangs swooped from high altitude, slashing through enemy formations with precision and fury. The Luftwaffe, caught off guard, scrambled in panic. Below, in the bellies of the bombers, crews looked up in astonishment. One gunner from the 100th Bomb Group, Dale Rice, recalled years later, "I looked up and saw the sun flash off their wings. One dipped its wing at us, just once, and I saw those paper tanks underneath. That's when we knew we weren't alone anymore." By midday, Berlin's air defenses were overwhelmed. The bombers dropped their loads and turned for home, escorted the entire way. For the first time, they made it back without crippling losses. At the debrief that evening, pilots were almost giddy. One laughed, saying, "Those damn paper bags held up better than iron." They had done the impossible. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe would never again claim the skies of Europe as their own. The Americans had brought the war to the gates of Berlin, carried there on tanks made of nothing but paper and glue. From that day on, the skies over Europe were never the same. The mission to Berlin shattered a myth the Luftwaffe had clung to for years, that single-engine American fighters could never reach their capital. Now, the myth lay burning in the wreckage of their airfields. For the Allies, the results were immediate and measurable. In just 3 months, bomber losses dropped from over 7% to barely 2%. Missions that had once ended in flaming chaos now returned in formation. The statistics looked almost unreal, but every airman who'd watched those silver Mustangs circle above knew exactly why. The little friends were finally staying the whole way. It wasn't just the range. Those paper tanks were performing miracles nobody expected. They created less drag, allowing Mustangs to climb faster, dive longer, and fight harder. And when they were hit by enemy fire, they didn't explode. They simply tore open, spilling fuel harmlessly into the air. Lieutenant John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group once said, "If I'm going to get shot, I'd rather have paper under my wings than a bomb waiting to go off." Meanwhile, the factories back in Britain were running day and night. Barwater Lloyd, once a newspaper plant, was now a war machine of its own. The same presses that once printed the Times now churned out sheets of laminated craft paper. Women worked in 3 shifts, gluing, rolling, and sealing every curve by hand. They weren't machinists or soldiers, they were paper workers, mothers, wives, daughters. And every tank they made carried the faint trace of newsprint beneath the lacquer words from yesterday's headlines flying into today's battle. A single B-17 carried 10 men. Each Mustang, with its pair of paper tanks, might protect a dozen of those bombers. So when the women at the plant looked at their hands stained with glue and resin, they understood what they were really holding. The difference between life and death. As the missions deepened into Germany, the Luftwaffe began to feel the pressure. Their fuel depots burned, their airfields were strafed in broad daylight. For the first time, nowhere in the Reich was truly safe. A German pilot later confessed, "Every time we took off, the Americans were already there above us, waiting." The tide had turned. And it was turning not through overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but through ingenuity, through a weapon so light it could be made in a print shop and thrown away after one use. The empire of steel was being undone by an army of paper. By the summer of 1944, the paper tank had become as common on Allied airfields as propellers and flight suits. At Bowater Lloyd's mill in Kent, machines that once printed headlines now printed war. Sheets of craft paper moved through presses like ribbons of gold, dipped in resin, cured, cut and rolled. Women, thousands of them, worked shoulder to shoulder, laminating layers that would soon fly over Europe. They called themselves the Paper Angels. Each tank they built might last only one mission, but that one mission could save 10 lives. Production ramped to astonishing levels. The United States ordered hundreds of thousands. The tanks were so light they could be shipped flat, stacked like folded cardboard, and assembled near the front lines. A single C-47 transport could carry hundreds of them. Soon, field depots across England were filled with crates labelled 108 gallons, paper tank handle with care. They were assembled by hand, often in makeshift workshops beside the runways. Crews could install them in minutes. The results were undeniable. By the time Allied armies landed in Normandy, the air war had completely reversed. German oil facilities were in ruins, transportation networks shattered, and Luftwaffe pilots, once kings of the sky, were scrambling for survival. Captured German intelligence officers couldn't hide their disbelief. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann admitted during interrogation, "The paper tank changed everything. It meant no place in Germany was safe." And he was right. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Their pilots were flying with barely 50 hours of training. Their aircraft factories were bombed into rubble. Even when new planes rolled off the line, there was no fuel left to fly them. The irony was brutal. An empire that prided itself on precision engineering on rockets, jets, and armored monsters was being undone by a disposable invention made of newspaper stock and glue. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the system worked like clockwork. The paper tanks were cheap, light, and easy to replace. Mechanics joked that if they ran out, they could borrow the morning paper and make 2 more. In reality, the tanks were more sophisticated than they looked. Their lamination process had evolved stronger, smoother, faster to produce. Engineers realized they could modify the resin formula for temperature and humidity, tailoring tanks for the Arctic cold or Mediterranean heat. By autumn, entire rail cars full of paper tanks were rolling toward forward airfields in France. Pilots like Francis Gabreski and Don Gentile swore by them. Gabreski's after-action report from July noted, "Perfect tank performance at -40 degrees, no leaks, no failures." Even the Germans tried to copy the idea, but their industrial base was too fractured. Paper mills were already overworked, printing maps and propaganda. Resin supplies were diverted to aircraft construction, and unlike the Allied system spread across hundreds of small workshops, the German war economy had become too centralized, too brittle to adapt. So while their rockets screamed skyward in desperation, the Allies quietly built an empire of paper, an empire that reached from Kent to Berlin, carried on the wings of Mustangs, each one a symbol of wartime ingenuity, each one a quiet, fluttering step closer to victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the story of the paper tank faded into the background, overshadowed by the roar of jet engines and the headlines of atomic fire. But for those who'd flown with them, the memory never left. The men who trusted their lives to those fragile cylinders remembered what they had meant. Reach, the power to strike deep, to protect, to come home alive. And that quiet miracle didn't end with the war. Engineers studying post-war technology realized that the resin-soaked paper used in those tanks was far more than a stopgap. It was a prototype. The layering, bonding, and curing techniques pioneered in those British paper mills became the foundation of early composite materials. Within a decade, the same chemistry was used in aircraft panels, fiberglass boat hulls, even the first printed circuit boards that would power the age of electronics. The presses that once rolled out newspaper tanks were repurposed to make television cabinets and instrument panels. Wartime improvisation had transformed into peacetime innovation. The cooperation that built those tanks, the British idea, the American mass production, became a blueprint for how the Allies would rebuild the world. Factories that once printed for war now printed for prosperity. In 1946, General James Doolittle summed it up best before Congress: the extension of fighter ranges through the British-made paper tanks was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe. From a newspaper mill in Kent to the skies over Berlin, the lesson was clear: greatness can be built from the simplest things. Lieutenant Overstreet, the young man who had written to his sweetheart on the eve of the Berlin mission, survived the war. His Mustang returned safely that day, its paper tanks jettisoned somewhere over Germany, dissolving quietly in the rain. He never knew exactly where they fell. Perhaps in a field, perhaps near a river. But wherever they landed, they carried history with them. Because those tanks, fragile, temporary, almost laughable, had given the Allies the one thing they needed most: reach. And that reach had changed everything. Sometimes, victory isn't found in steel or firepower. Sometimes it's found in glue, paper, and the hands of ordinary people who refuse to give up. When William Overstreet folded that letter to Virginia, he couldn't have known that history would hinge on the quiet work of mill hands, chemists, and engineers who turned paper into power. The story of the paper drop tank isn't about spectacle. It's about ingenuity, about how the smallest idea, born from scarcity, can outlast the mightiest empires. In a world obsessed with force, it was fragility that found a way to fly. And high above the clouds of Europe, as the Mustangs roared home with empty wings and full hearts, the lesson of that fragile invention echoed through history, that sometimes the lightest things carry the heaviest hope.